Bandwidth on signal-to-noise ratio and thus range goes by the formula minus 174 dBm, which is a 1 hertz bandwidth noise, plus 10 times the log of the bandwidth in hertz of the receiver. So 500 hertz bandwidth, which is CW narrow here, would give us receiver noise of minus 147 dBm. So 10 dB carrier to noise ratio would require minus 137 dBm on the signal coming in, or 0.032 microvolts. Narrow single sideband, 2200 hertz, whatever. Receiver noise would be 140.5. 10 dB, of course, would be 130.5 for 0.066. 2700 hertz bandwidth, which is considered single sideband wide. Receiver noise would be 139.7 dBm, or 129.7 dBm for 10 dB carrier to noise, 0.073, not too much difference between these. 6000 hertz bandwidth, which is digital narrow band, like D-Star, 136 minus 136 dBm, 126 dBm, 0.112 microvolts. 1200 hertz bandwidth, digital narrow, normal on System Fusion, 133.2, 123.2, 0.154 microvolts. And typical FM is about 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz bandwidth, minus 130, minus 120, 0.224. So let's see what the comparisons are between single sideband wide and typical FM. These are the values, and it's 8.8 dB in favor of the single sideband signal. 500 hertz CW versus typical FM would be these two values for 16.8 dB in favor of CW. And 500 hertz CW versus single sideband wide would be these two values, or 7.3 dB in favor of the CW over sideband. Oh, let's go back one here. FT8 is even better than CW because its effective bandwidth is less due to the way it's accomplished. Many QSOs have been had between the West Coast and Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries on 6 meters using FT8 in 2020, for example. And those signals would not even be heard on single sideband, and probably might not be heard even if you had the radio in the CW position. Many FT8 QSOs have been completed with moderately equipped 2-meter moon bounce stations, just using a 9 to 12 element beam aimed at the horizon, again with FT8. And of course, a lot of the lack of gain here on the antenna on this end is made up by the larger antennas on the other end of the circuit of well-equipped moon-bound stations in this instance. Here we have a typical chart of FM versus AM, and I've added a line for sideband there in blue. With the beta of 2 here for FM, you see the curves are about the same until we hit the threshold here at about 20 dB. And then the FM drops off very, very rapidly down as you go much below the 8 dB or so signal to noise ratio. But you still hear the sideband down quite low here because it's a linear function, unlike FM. And AM, of course, is the worst of it, and really narrow band FM is not as good as sideband either. So this is just due to the narrower bandwidth because the sideband has about 13 dB carrier to noise at 2.5 kilohertz bandwidth versus FM at 20 kilohertz bandwidth. Here's an example of that. 2 stations in the North San Francisco Bay Area as received in San Jose at my house. effect of FT8 on communications is shown here, and also a propagation effect called tropoducting, which is common over water paths. CT8/W6PQL, who is Jim, who lives in Fremont, north of here, north of San Jose at least. But anyway, he has a place in the Azores as well. His wife is from there, and they built a house there that they go to for a couple of months every year. Anyway, he worked ON4 KHG in Belgium using FT8 over a 2,875 kilometer path, which is about 786 miles. This took advantage of tropoducting over and over the water path as well. Obviously not too many mountains in the way. And ON4 KHG here has also worked CU8 AO on single sideband on a 2,991 kilometer path. So that's also possible when tropo is good. And of course, both of these stations, well, probably all three, have done this many times using moon bounce and FT8, probably sideband too. His moon bounce and tropo circularly polarized array in the Azores is here, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's probably a 22 element circularly polarized beams here on a fairly short tower. And then I've worked him 250 watts or so into a dipole on 20 meters as well. And this is his HF antenna sitting here just off the water, salt water, of course, so probably pretty good ground situation for Jim there. And he's there a couple of months every summer. Unfortunately, urban and suburban noise levels are fairly high for those of us who are living in the city or suburbs. Rural is a lot lower typically, although in this case of this group, World Meteorological Organization data, they didn't see much difference between suburban and rural. So it just depends on location, I suppose. But anyway, let's compare single sideband versus FM here. To get a 10 dB carrier noise would take minus 108 dBm versus 99 on FM. So 99 is a higher level of FM's required. On 400 megs, 432, 131, and 120. So that's about 10th microvolt, something like that. On 1296, in this case it's 1.5 gigs, but this is pretty close. 133 and 123 on FM, and 133 and 124. So these are pretty much the same. Once you get up this high in frequency, the external noise, urban noise at least, doesn't impact you as much as it does at 432 and at 2 meters here. So that gives you a general idea of what it is. And you can get the information here by going to this site. Another place you can go is here at Okan University. This is the address for them. And that's where I got the slides for the AM versus FM versus sideband. Well, I added the sideband, but anyway, it's a pretty good study of expected noise levels in urban, suburban, and rural and airport environments. So you can look this up on online if you want to do more study of this. Fortunately, modern receivers can clean up some of this noise. There's digital noise reduction and noise blankers in most of the newer radios. Here's an example of my radio with urban noise in my location. Turned off dynamic noise reduction, turned off the noise blanker. Noise blanker back on. Noise reduction back on. Clearly quite an advantage there. Here's some sample signals of stations I work quite regularly, one in Santa Cruz and one in Fresno area, or Clovis really.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can get Tom up on 1296 here. Let me get the antenna back his way. Okay, we're coming around on you now, Tom. KW6S, W6KQL. Can we QSY to other bands? I would look forward to that. Do you want to hit 1296 first? Yeah, that's all running and ready. I'll see.
Now, there are some VHF and UHF propagation modes in Northern California. This is just a list of some of them. Reflections off the mountains like Mount Amanum, Loma Prieta, Western Hills, Mount Diablo. And you get knife edging signals bending or refracting across sharp peaks in some areas. Tropospheric ducting caused by temperature inversions along the coast especially, or over water. Airplane reflections identified by very rapid flutter. So that's signals bouncing off airplanes and therefore getting over the tops of the mountains. Use of really tall towers such as Mount Amanum, Loma Prieta, Cañada College, Mount Hamilton, Mount Diablo, Fremont Peak and Salinas, Chews Ridge, which is southeast of Carmel, Mount St. Helena in the North Bay. And this is often done for SOTA or VHF and UHF contests. People can get a couple hundred miles quite easily from these mountains. Moondowns, of course, using high-power CW or single sideband is another way people get long-distance communication. And FT8 has opened this up to 100 to 200 watt stations who have maybe a 9 or 12 element beam. Larger moonbound stations are able to work these QRP guys, as they would probably say. But because they only have moderate power, but the bigger stations, of course, can hear them better and can certainly get back to them.